Hi, I'm Danny Duchamp, sitting in my shitty Honda Fit and talking to you all about the Count Dankula trial. Well, ostensibly about the Count Dankula trial. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard enough of these videos by this point, giving the basic and important arguments for free speech, why we can't ban things that are offensive. I mean, what if I'm offended by you banning things that are offensive? Paradox. Or perhaps people explaining quite clearly and simply how a man teaching his dog to respond to the phrase "gas the Jews" is probably just doing that as some kind of a dark joke rather than as an honest attempt to get Jews gassed. But yeah, I think you've probably heard enough of those sorts of videos by now. In case you want a quick rundown of why this trial is just mind-bendingly horrific and a terrible dark day for the state of British free speech, I'll link this one here by Ellie Yap. Great video, and she's a Jew herself, so according to the progressive stack, I think that means you have to listen to her on this one. I'm not entirely sure how that thing works, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Anyway, so yeah, I'm not going to do another one of those videos. What I want to talk to you today about is just taking a step back and trying to figure out, well, why does the UK have such a terrible track record with free speech lately? Because it does. This is not by any means an isolated incident. Here's an article about two guys getting arrested when they made offensive comments about a dead British soldier on Twitter. Here's a 15-year-old boy who was arrested for a racist tweet he made about some footballer. Here's one from Glasgow, Scotland again. The guy tweeted about some lorry driver who drove over some pedestrians, and he made a pretty dark joke about it that you can see here, but I think we can all agree not something that someone should be arrested for. And these examples are just for illustrative purposes. I could not possibly list all of them, seeing as how in London alone there are hundreds of people every year who are arrested for posts on social media. And the most common reason for that is sending offensive, obscene, or menacing messages. Pretty weak for something to arrest someone over, I think you'll agree. And the British police are not shy about their track record arresting people for social media posts that someone might hypothetically find offensive. Wiltshire Police's official Twitter account says, "You can't hide from us if you're spewing abuse from behind a computer screen. Our boys and gals in blue will find you." Or the Scottish Police, "You may think online you are anonymous, you can create fake profiles and no one can trace you. That's wrong. The messages you type and send can be traced back to you. The same laws apply to online messages, images and videos. What you post now can affect you later in life." These are official law enforcement Twitter accounts, something that probably shouldn't exist, but they do, and they are bragging about arresting people over offensive tweets. Offensive tweets! Okay. So, in addition to that, there's also the UK's strange position on hate crimes. You can see on the Metropolitan Police's website that if someone does something that isn't a criminal offence but the victim or anyone else believes it was motivated by prejudice or hate, we would class this as a hate incident. Though what the perpetrator has done may not be against the law, their reasons for doing it are. This means that it may be possible to charge them with an offence. I mean, that is literal thought policing. What the hell, UK? And by the way, they've changed the wording on their website about that one now. I'll post a link to the archived version, though, so you can see that I didn't make it up. They've only changed the wording in response to the backlash, not the actual laws they're enforcing or the policies by which they enforce it. They're just being less transparent about it. Now, that's a pretty abysmal case for free speech in the UK. It's not doing too well. I think we can all agree. But the question I want to talk about in this video is, why is that the case? And is there anything that the old Brits over there could hypothetically be doing to fix it? Maybe something that a lesson that we can take as to what not to do in order to get to that position in terms of free speech. Well, first of all, I want to compare it with a country that does a lot better on free speech, which is the US. Right? The UK and the US are the two main countries that we tend to focus on when talking about legal affairs and things like that, political philosophy, because they're just the two most obvious examples. And I'm going to continue with that. I'm not going to break the mold there, and compare the US to the UK. Now, I won't go into the specifics because I can't really give examples of the US not doing these things, but the US doesn't do any of these things. At the very least, you must admit that the Dankula trial could not possibly have happened in the US. Okay, so why has the US managed to hold on to free speech so much better than the UK? I think that there are three main answers to that, and I don't think any one of them on its own is enough to explain it, so I think that they're all really important. The first one is really quite simple. If you look at these stats from Pew Research, you can see that the support for free speech in the US is notably higher on pretty much every subject in the US than it is in the rest of the world. They tend to support people's ability to say offensive or upsetting things far more than most people. Now, this explains some of that difference, but as you can see on this other graph, if you compare it to Europe, it doesn't seem quite as big of a difference. I mean, the US is still ahead in most of these categories that you can see on screen here, but in general, Europe and Britain specifically is not too far behind in terms of public support for free speech. So this will only explain some of the difference, not all of it. Now, there's another one that I'm sure that most of the American viewers will be saying, especially if they're of the conservative bent, which is that the Second Amendment supports the First, and that's probably true. I mean, there's a lot of people will say, oh, what are you going to do? Shoot politicians to make sure that they don't stop you from speaking freely? And not directly, no, it's more of like a game theory thing. I mean, politicians are less likely to do things that upset huge portions of the population if those huge portions of the population are armed. It's pretty simple. That being said, that's probably not something that us here in New Zealand or the UK especially is going to be able to enact. I mean, the UK has a pretty terrible track record of defending its citizens' rights to keep any potential weapon. Like, I mean, look here at them bragging about confiscating a butter knife and a bicycle wheel. It's just, the UK is not going to get the right to bear arms. They're just going to have to do without that one. So what is the third one? Because I think that this one is the one that British people should be focusing on. Don't get me wrong, the first one, the defending freedom of speech by just making more people in favor of it, you know, just spreading the word, that's obviously a good thing. I think that you should sign you should send the letters that Academic Agent was suggesting you send. If you haven't seen what he was talking about, I'll give a link to that in the description as well. But I think that the most fundamental thing that you should be pushing for is the final reason that the US tends to do better than the UK on free speech. And that is the First Amendment, of course. In the US, there is a constitution which every law must be tested by. The politicians might pass some crazy anti-free speech law, but it's just going to be an invalid one. It'll be struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. They have a fundamentally enshrined right to freedom of speech. And the government is a difficult thing to control. I mean, if you want to try to get the government to support some given right, you really have to make it clear and unambiguous. The reason is because of governmental creep. The politicians will just, sort of have varying interest groups that they'll support, and they'll, gradually grow the government by supporting those interest groups in one way or another. This group is offended by that group, so they need one little change here and another change there. And they're often too numerous for the voter to actually make any decisions based on them. And so there's no democratic disincentive for those politicians making those little incremental reductions in freedom of speech or freedom of anything else for that matter. However, if you have some fundamental principle and just no laws can ever violate this principle unless, you get a specific push to get rid of that principle, then that's much harder to just slowly, incrementally chip away at. The difference is in the UK, they don't have anything like this. I mean, I'll read this little bit from the British Library. There are a number of associated characteristics of Britain's unwritten constitution, a cardinal one being that law in Parliament is sovereign in the sense of being the supreme legislative body. Since there is no documentary constitution containing laws that are fundamental in status and superior to ordinary acts of Parliament, the courts may only interpret parliamentary statutes. They may not overrule or declare them invalid for being contrary to the constitution and unconstitutional. So that's the primary reason that Britain fails to defend freedom of speech while America succeeds at doing so. You have to have some fundamental principles which the government has to explicitly get rid of at an all-in-one go, or they can't chip away at it. Because if they can chip away at it, they will. If they have to get rid of the whole thing, you're not going to get everyone to say, yeah, fuck freedom of speech, we're against that principle. So if I were you, Britain, what I would be doing is trying to petition the government, petition your politicians to try to get together and see if there is any way feasible within British law to have almost a constitution. There needs to be a fundamental right that doesn't just govern what people can do, but how the government can pass laws, which laws the government is allowed to pass. If there is no such fundamental principle on which the government is required to govern, well, then they're just going to do whatever the various interest groups push them to do that day. And you're never going to keep on top of all of that. It's just unfeasible. At the end of the day, the government is a horrifying beast that will eat everything in its path unless you can restrain it properly. And you're not going to be able to do that by just gently nudging it in the correct directions just constantly. You're going to get tired. You have to put some solid chains around it to prevent it from doing stuff you don't want it to do. That's about it. State of Excuses Part 2 should be coming early next month, and I've also got a long, boring philosophy video, so that'll be fun. I'll talk to you guys soon. Get out of my shitty Honda Fit.